Motorists must brace themselves for a massive fuel price hike next month.
South Africans continue to feel the pinch of rising costs.
From higher electricity and water tariffs to higher costs of food and fuel, it now costs more than ever to survive.
Get this, prices have climbed more than 40% since May last year. What's going on?
Even though you don't have a car, you're definitely impacted by the increase in petrol price.
Demand for oil has climbed, of course, as the global economy has improved. But this month, we're talking about a massive hike.
These added economic pressures may be the final nail in the coffin for many.
All of these factors are going to come together and literally a tsunami of price increase is going to hit. And we just cannot, as a country, really afford that.
Consumers don't have space anymore in their budgets to make cuts. They've been doing this for a very long time. And since the pandemic has started, they've had to make changes. But they can only make changes, to a certain point. And then there is just nothing else that can be done. But very, very hard knock on here.
We have big opportunities to change that. But that needs moral courage from leadership in government to change the course of this country's economic trajectory. If they don't do that, then we push ourselves closer to a failed state.
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Siviwe Kwahube. I am the DA's national spokesperson, and this morning I'm joined by DA leader John Steenhuisen, and I'm also joined by our Shadow Minister of Energy, Kevin Milam. And we've convened this press conference today to particularly discuss the issue of the rising fuel costs. The reality is that these costs are not just about road users or those who are car owners. These costs are very much driving up the cost of food, the cost of public transport for many South Africans. Even the increase we saw, or the 5.3 increase we saw in social grants, was completely wiped out by the 9% increase in electricity tariffs alone. So what we are saying today is that grant recipients and the millions of South Africans who are on the receiving end of this crippling cost of living shouldn't have to choose between keeping the lights on or having a warm plate of food. But this kind of crisis that we are seeing today is one that is going to lead us to a point where South Africans are really stretched to their absolute limits. And that's why we need a caring government that's going to step into the breach and cushion people from the crippling poverty and unemployment that is currently being faced. So this morning, the DA is presenting a number of interventions that we would like to propose around how we can slash the cost of the fuel price so that we can make sure that South Africans are not driven to the ends of poverty due to the fuel costs. So, John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Siviwe, and good morning to journalists that are present, but also to those who are joining us online today, and thank you for tuning in. The DA is going to be leading the charge to slash fuel prices in South Africa. The price of petrol is set to go up by around about 4 Rand per litre next week, which will push us over 25 Rand a litre. As Siviwe has said, that this will drive up food prices even further and will deal a devastating blow to South Africans who are already struggling to put food on the table. If we don't stop this fuel price increase, millions more people will fall into poverty. The input costs for farmers will rise dramatically. Children will be stunted, people will starve, businesses will go bankrupt, jobs will be lost, and mass riots and unrest could be unleashed, as we've seen occurring in places like Sri Lanka in the last fortnight, where people have protested against rising fuel prices there. The timing of this particular fuel price increase in South Africa could also not be worse, as our citizens are battling a 46% unemployment rate, stage 4 rolling blackouts, which are affecting productivity and reaching deep into homes, and also irrational COVID regulations, the floodings and droughts that are taking place around the country, collapsing service delivery, and added to that now the global impact of supply chain inflation, the inflation tsunami, but also the food price inflation linked to the obvious war in Ukraine brought about by Russia's invasion. It is simply inconceivable there that South Africa's government could, in these circumstances, even consider hitting South African consumers with a petrol price hike of this particular nature. Essentially, what they will be doing is kicking a nation while it is already down on its knees. South Africans simply cannot afford this petrol price increase, and the reality is that they shouldn't have to. The fuel price is one of the last remaining regulated and centrally controlled consumer prices in South Africa. Fuel is also, in the South African context, grossly overtaxed, with a full 33% of that fuel cost per litre going directly into government coffers. It's literally being used as a cash cow from Treasury, who are continuously now milking consumers who are already suffering. And this has to end. Petrol in places like Swaziland, Mozambique, Botswana, Tanzania, Namibia, and Kenya is on average around about 5 Rand cheaper per litre because their governments don't tax it as much. The South African government can do something about this, but the reality that South Africans need to understand is that they are choosing to sit on their hands and not do something about it. It's time now for South Africans as a nation to stand together and to stand up and unite and say enough is enough. We need to stand together to make it very clear to government that we're not just simply going to roll over and accept this fuel price increase as an inevitability of government's failures, just like they expect us to just roll over and accept that rolling blackouts are somehow normal, that unemployment is somehow normal, that the mass starvation of young children in South Africa is somehow normal. This is not normal, and we should not be accepting it. It should not become the status quo in South Africa. The DA is pursuing, therefore, every single possible angle to ensure that we can prevent the upcoming rise in fuel prices and to slash fuel prices going forward, because we know the devastating consequence it is going to have on an already disastrous situation in the country. We're therefore going to fight on behalf of every single South African, whether you're a taxi commuter, someone who has been hit by food price inflation, or whether you're a motorist or a taxi or transport operator. We're all going to be bearing the brunt of this particular issue because we care about the plight of ordinary South Africans. I'm pleased also to announce that the Speaker of the National Assembly has acceded now to the DA's debate of urgent public importance on the fuel price hikes. We urgently need to have a national discussion around fuel price hikes and the measures that we can be taking and the measures that government must be taking to prevent these price hikes from taking place. During the course of that debate, I can announce today that we will be proposing 3 key interventions, which we believe could immediately alleviate the situation and bring much needed relief to ordinary South Africans, to ordinary households, as well as to businesses and farmers. The first of these suggestions is for us to immediately scrap the general fuel levy. The general fuel levy accounts for around 3.93 Rand per litre of fuel, and it's little more than a corruption tax. Road users are essentially reimbursing National Treasury for taxpayer funds lost to corruption and maladministration and wasteful expenditure. By cutting wasteful expenditure, like reducing the size of the cabinet, as we suggested a few months ago, reducing the burden of the 8 billion Rand per annum of VIP protection services to ministers and members of the executive, by cutting wasteful expenditure on luxuries like catering and entertainment, and uprooting state capture corruption, which has cost South Africa in the region of 1.5 trillion Rand already, the general fuel levy of 3.93 Rand can be scrapped entirely. It is a lazy way of bringing in income, and it is a lazy way to avoid making the hard choices of cutting back the size of government and cutting back on government's own expenditure. The second intervention which we suggest is to give exemptions to the Road Accident Fund levy. Through a SARS rebate, government should exempt those who already pay for comprehensive third-party insurance from the RAF levy. This includes bus, taxi and transport companies, as well as private commuters. This would therefore free up the Road Accident Fund from claims for those drivers and could potentially save drivers another R2.18 per litre, who would get this back in the form of a tax rebate from the South African Revenue Services. The third intervention, which we're demanding today, is that the cost of fuel can be further reduced by deregulating the fuel sector to spur competition between sellers. And the DA has a private members' bill currently tabled in Parliament which would call for this. The forces of market competition among fuel sellers in a market for 11 billion litres of fuel a year would naturally drive down prices, as competition for the business of consumers, like any other consumer good, would eventually see that price being driven down. It is only reasonable that the same market competition that's applied to other consumer goods and services in South Africa is used to determine the final fuel price at the pump that consumers are expected to pay. As I said, to this end, we have a private members' bill which is already in place, and we hope that parties in the House are going to support it, and we hope that members of the public will be putting pressure on their political parties that they've supported, and we call upon civil society as well to join that fight, to get behind that bill so that we can ensure that we have better and more competitive prices for fuel in South Africa. We're calling upon the ANC government to implement these measures that we have put forward today in order to achieve the reduction in fuel prices necessary to avert mass hunger as well as suffering. We're calling on all South Africans, no matter which political persuasion, as well as civil society organizations, as well as NGOs, to please get behind our campaign, to please sign the national letter to government, to the Ministers of Finance and Energy, to help prevent the fuel price in June. It's only going to be through united action as South Africans that we send a very clear message to government that we are now, as consumers and as citizens of the country, drawing a line in the sand. It is not fair to put the price of your corruption, your maladministration, your bloated bureaucracy, your inability to plan for the future into the tax burden on ordinary citizens. And it's time now for citizens to say that line in the sand is here, and we're not going to allow this government to cross it. If government gets away with driving this fuel price forward, it is going to open the floodgates for more and more fuel prices, which will make transport more expensive, input costs on agriculture more expensive, and will bring suffering and hardship through greater food prices as well as even bigger inflation. If we don't stand together now and send a clear message to government, it's going to be open season for them to just keep on putting on the tax burden onto the ordinary citizens. Now is the time to slash fuel prices, and we're calling upon all South Africans to join this fight against government and against this irrational, unreasonable and grossly unfair fuel price increase. Thank you.
Good morning. As John indicated, fuel prices in South Africa have been artificially inflated by at least 33% in the form of the General Fuel Levy and the Road Accident Fund Levy. After decades of sustained increases, these levies have become little more than exorbitant corruption taxes that abuse road users into paying for the mismanagement that has bled our country dry. And they serve only to prop up a corrupt and dysfunctional ANC government. Amidst crippling inflation, South Africans simply cannot afford to continue paying artificially high fuel prices. This corruption tax not only affects road users, but directly leads to similarly unaffordable increases on the price of food and all other goods that are transported by road. As a party that cares very deeply about the suffering experienced by South Africans, the DA is fighting to scrap the general fuel levy. With food and fuel prices spiraling out of control, South Africans simply cannot afford to pay another R3.93 per litre in the form of the general fuel levy to make up for money lost to corruption and wasteful spending. We demand, on behalf of all South Africans, that the ANC government scrap the general fuel levy immediately. Secondly, as John has indicated, we are proposing through a SARS tax rebate to exempt bus, taxi, agriculture and transport companies, as well as private commuters who pay for comprehensive third-party insurance, to be exempted from the Road Accident Fund levy, currently a further R2.18 per litre. And just to put that in perspective, a freight company filling up a truck might put 1,000 litres of petrol into that truck. That's 2,180 Rand going straight to the Road Accident Fund every time that truck fills up. On paper, the Road Accident Fund should play an important role in protecting road accident victims from uninsured drivers. However, like most other government institutions, the RAF is riddled with maladministration and corruption. The victim of a driver who has full and comprehensive third-party insurance, including loss of future income, receives the exact same compensation as a Road Accident Fund claimant. This makes the role of the RAF unnecessary for all drivers who have such insurance. In addition to removing or to reducing fuel prices, this move would significantly lower the cost of food and other goods, as fully insured bus, taxi and transport companies would be able to pass that saving of R2.18 per litre on to commuters and consumers. So the DA today demands that the ANC government relieves fuel consumers of this further excessive tax and allow third-party insurance and the private sector insurance companies to do their job. To avoid corruption, ensure efficient implementation, and incentivize more consumers to acquire third-party insurance, the South African Revenue Service should administer the exemption in the form of a tax rebate. Then, as part of filling in your tax returns annually, commuters and companies would provide proof of insurance to SARS, which would then reimburse them the full amount spent on fuel on the RAF levy during the preceding year. Our third proposal goes even further to lower the fuel price. This involves deregulation of the fuel price to expand competition in the sector. Now, in 1998, the government in the Energy White Paper expressed a strong desire to deregulate the fuel industry and remove government-mandated price controls. We sit 24 years later with the exact same formula-based and calculated automatic pricing adjustments. Elimination of fuel price controls and industry margins at wholesale and retail level, while retaining oversight on price collusion and anti-competitive behavior, will help promote competition for market share through competitive fuel pricing. The diesel price in South Africa is an example of exactly how deregulation and competition can often accrue in competitive retail prices for consumers. Since deregulation of the diesel retail price, diesel has been retailing 20% cheaper than the retail price of petrol. As soon as it became clear that the government had no intention to extend the fuel tax, the fuel levy reduction beyond the May deadline, and the magnitude of the projected fuel price increase in June became apparent, the DA immediately took steps to find ways through which consumers could be protected from the fuel price shock. Key steps that we have taken to raise the alarm on the impact that the fuel price increase and the effect it will have on our economy include, as John indicated, we submitted a request to the Speaker of Parliament of the National Assembly, Nosiviwe Mapisa and Kakula, for a debate of urgent national importance on the impact of steeply rising fuel prices on the cost of living and the steps that must urgently be taken to shield the poor from the worst effects of this. Parliament has a duty to act whenever the country is faced with an urgent national crisis. As John again pointed out, we have today learned that the Speaker has acceded to this request, and we call on all parties to support us in this debate. The Democratic Alliance is in the process of introducing its private members' bill to deregulate the fuel price to encourage competition between wholesalers and retailers. And this legislation will seek to protect consumers from exorbitant price increases by decoupling the basic fuel price from government taxes and levies, as well as additional margins used by wholesalers and retailers. Again, we will call on all parties in Parliament to support this. How can they refuse when this will directly lower fuel prices and have a direct impact on our spiraling inflation rate? The Democratic Alliance also has a petition underway calling on Ministers Mantashe and Godongwana to cut the exorbitant taxes on fuel. That petition has generated over 40,000 signatures in just over 40 hours. This is almost 1,000 signatures per hour. South Africans know the implications that fuel priced at 25 Rand a litre means for their ability to survive in a tough economic environment. They're united in their call to deregulate and slash fuel taxes. Again, we call on all South Africans to sign our letter to the ministers at slashfuelprices.co.za. The premise of our public campaign is that perpetually increasing fuel prices stifle economic recovery and break consumers' backs. South Africans have absorbed enough economic shocks over the past few years, and it's unconscionable to expect them to take another tax increase in the form of a fuel price hike. It is time for the ANC government to abandon these taxes immediately, and that is our demand to them. Ministers Mantashe and Godongwana have sat idly by for the last 2 months while South Africans continue to suffer. Instead of immediately reviewing the fuel pricing model as they promised and bringing relief to consumers, these ministers have allowed the clock to run down, and now we face a massive price jump. The DA demands immediate action from government to slash the fuel price. We cannot afford ANC incompetence to further drag us down the road to a failed state. The DA cares deeply about this, and we will keep up this fight in every way we can, in every forum we can, to ensure that South African consumers are protected to the very end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Just a reminder to our colleagues, media houses that are joining us on the virtual platform on Zoom, to please send through your questions to our team so that they can be filtered through to us, so that I can allocate the questions to the panel here. We're now going to move on to the question and answer session of the press conference so that we can get further details or any clarifying questions that you may have. I have some questions here that have come across to us. The first one is, how does the DA intend to fill the funding gap that would be created by the removal of the fuel levy? Perhaps, Kevin, you can answer that. The second one is, the president does not control oil prices. What would the DA have done to prevent the increases? John, if you can please answer that question. The DA proposes SARS a tax rebate to individuals and transport companies that pay third-party insurance in lieu of the road accident fund. How will the poor, most of whom who do not have insurance, benefit from this? Please, Kevin, can you cover that in answering the question? I think it's an important one about how would we have prevented this and why we are moving with our public campaign. Thanks, John.
Thanks very much for the question, and I think it's a good one. Yes, of course, the president doesn't control oil prices, but you've got to be able to manage the things that are within your own control in a way to be able to ensure that they are mitigated against. And those three measures that we've announced today would essentially buffer South African consumers from having to bear the brunt of this particular fuel price increase. Yes, the president doesn't control things like the international wheat price, but there are things we could be doing in South Africa to mitigate against what is a looming food shortage in South Africa. The reality is that on all of these key issues, and I hope people do remember that a few weeks ago in Parliament, in fact, just over a month ago, I brought a number of key consumer goods into Parliament to show the president the increase of them, largely driven by the increased transport costs as related to the rise in fuel. Those have now been added to by the global impact of the war in Ukraine and other things. We've made some suggestions around things that government can do on these. One of them is our Shadow Trade and Industry Minister has suggested that government drops the import tariffs on chicken and eggs, like Mexico has done, to ensure that their citizens can eat and that food prices are protected. We've suggested that government drops the sugar tax on food goods. We've suggested that government lowers the VAT on certain categories of beef and chicken proteins to be able to make those things there. So what government cannot do, and what citizens must not let government get away with, is this, well, this is out of our control. We can't, be buffeted by the global headwinds, the way the price moves internationally. Yes, that may be true to an extent, but your job as a government is to do what you can do with the things that are within your ability to be able to prevent that knock-on effect from hurting your consumers. Other countries are doing it. India's doing it. Mexico is doing it. Most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are doing it through not taking as much tax out of the fuel. Don't let this government get away with saying to you, well, there's nothing we can do. There are things that they can do. On a macro level, the reform agenda in South Africa is one of the best things that government can do to shield and protect its citizens from the economic devastation. Additionally, the president could make the choice to reduce the size of the cabinet, to reduce the size of government, reduce the size of the civil service. All of these things are tough, but the necessary reforms that are required to move South Africa forward. Instead, it seems far easier for the president and the team in government to simply just keep putting the tax burden up on citizens through levies, charges, costs, etc. They increased VAT a few years ago. People may have forgotten that already. That VAT price has never been decreased again. And no doubt government will be looking for ways to raise taxes rather than make the hard decisions around cutting where they can and doing the interventions that governments around the world are already taking to shield their citizens from the worst effects of this crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, John. The first question related to the funding gap that would be created by cutting these taxes. And John has touched on some of the measures that could be implemented to address these, including the bloated cabinet and bloated public service. But we also need to look at austerity measures as a government. We shouldn't be building 22 million rand flagpoles when our country is in a crisis, when the cost of living is out of control. Now, to just put it in perspective, the South African fuel sector, or the amount of petrol that is used in South Africa, is roughly 11 billion litres per year. The taxes that we're talking about amount to about 6 rand per litre. So you're looking at about 66 billion rand per year. That would be the funding shortfall that we're looking for here. John touched on the point earlier that over the past 27 years, state capture has amounted to 1.5 trillion rand. That's 1,500 billion rand. We're looking for 66 billion a year. If we got rid of the corrupt, if we got rid of the mismanagement, if we got rid of the wasteful expenditure, if we stopped spending money on vanity projects like flagpoles and donating money to Cuba, we would be able to easily afford this and keep the price shock from South African consumers. The second part of the question was the impact on the poor. And here I think that it has multiple impacts. The first is direct, and that is the cost of transportation. Every day when somebody is getting in a taxi to go to work, or in a car to go to work, or wherever to go to school, or whatever it may be, the cost of the fuel price has a direct impact on their ability to do that. So that's the direct impact. But there's also the indirect impact, and that's on the cost of road transport. And here we're talking about freight companies, buses, etc. And here we have a saving that is, or a cost that is transferred directly into the cost of the goods that you purchase. But you can go back a third step, and that is the cost of fuel in agriculture and production. John mentioned that we've had stage 4 rolling blackouts. Many people are running generators. What do they run those generators on? Fuel. Now, every time you fill up a generator and run it to keep your business operating, it's pushing the price of production up. It's pushing the cost to the consumer up. So every single facet of our economy is impacted by the fuel price. And we are saying that the cost of living and inflation are going to be impacted by government's inability or unwillingness to address this crisis as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I've got 3 more questions. Again, colleagues on the virtual platform, also colleagues here who would like to ask questions, please feel free to do so. And so perhaps before I take some of the questions that are coming through online, are there any questions coming from the room? No? All right. Okay, cool. So I've got a question from Linda Ensor, Business Day. How can the fiscus do without the billions of rands that is collected from the general fuel levy? This will have to entail cuts elsewhere. The second question is, what will a debate in Parliament achieve when it comes to this matter? Then the third question from Jeffreys Bay Online News, why does only consumers have to pay for fuel and not members of Parliament and ministers? And I think perhaps I should handle the question around the importance of Parliament. The reality is that Parliament cannot simply be a spectator while South Africans are facing possibly the biggest cost of living crisis since 1994. As a parliament and as legislators, it is absolutely our duty to hold the executive to account, to come and bring them before Parliament and propose workable solutions on how we can cushion South Africans against the rising cost of living. And so this is why a debate in Parliament is not just about posturing and debating, but it is about putting down solutions. It is about tying down the executive to some of the proposals that we are putting forward. It's also about holding them to account, because ultimately, as members of Parliament, we are elected in the House to represent the people of South Africa, and millions of them are literally at the receiving end of the high cost of living, which is really crippling people in the worst kind of way. And so, John, if you can perhaps handle the question, and Kevin, if you can just then wrap up on the funding shortfall.
Thanks. I think Linda asked a very good question, and I think that is the question that all South Africans should be asking. That is, why is government using fuel levies to raise money and extract money out of citizens when other countries in the sub-Saharan region and in Africa do not do that? As I've said earlier, the presentation I made, fuel is up to 5 rand cheaper in neighboring countries than it is in South Africa because their governments are not extractive in that. And I think it cuts to the bigger question that we should be asking as South Africans. Is that why must we bear this burden? Why is it now the responsibility of ordinary citizens to plug this particular billions rand gap, when the low-hanging fruit that could come from just a few minor reforms would be able to unlock and achieve more of that. So, for instance, the size of the cabinet, and I've spoken about it, and sorry to go on about it again, but I think it is indicative that we are continuously, as consumers and citizens, being told to cut our cloth accordingly. And that every time we have to tighten our belts, every time there's a petrol price increase, we are asked to bear the pain. We are asked to be the ones that have to suffer as citizens. When is it time for government to tighten its belt? When is it time for the president to cut his cloth accordingly? We have one of the largest cabinets in the world, one of the most inefficient and ineffective cabinets in the world. It's double the size of some of the countries that are our peers around the world, and yet we continue to perpetuate with this massively bloated cabinet. There are huge savings, billions of rands, by reducing the cabinet, making a lean, efficient and effective cabinet. The size of the civil service is something the President has promised to deal with for many, many years, but has yet to even start to grasp the nettle on. We spend a huge amount of our GDP on a bloated, oversized cabinet that has been stuffed full of cadres through almost 2 decades of cadre deployment. We have a Home Affairs Department that cannot issue passports and birth certificates and treats our citizens in an inhumane way. We have a motor vehicle licensing and driver's license issuing authority that cannot issue driver's licenses. We have hospitals that don't heal the sick. We have an arms manufacturing company that doesn't manufacture arms. We have an airline that doesn't fly. And we have an electricity regulator, generator and supplier that doesn't generate, regulate or supply electricity. All of these are because we have a bloated, inefficient and ineffective state. Then we also have 50 million rand going off to Cuba. And as you would have seen from parliamentary questions that I've put in, that amount of money that's gone to Cuba has actually been far more over the last few years. Why are we sending money to Cuba when our own citizens are starving to death around the country? Why are we sending money to Cuba when our own fuel prices are skyrocketing and our own citizens are suffering? And so I don't buy the argument that it's up to citizens to now try and make up the shortfall. Government must now cut its cloth accordingly. It has squeezed the living daylights out of consumers, taxpayers, and ordinary citizens for almost 2 decades now. It's time for government to tighten its own belt. It's time for government to start cutting its cloth accordingly. And it's time for the citizens to start getting a bit of relief. Because if we continue with a situation where whenever there's a need to generate income, we turn again to our citizens and keep raising the burden on them, on making their costs go up, well, where does it end? Eventually we'll end up with a completely decimated and destroyed tax base, and eventually you come to a point where you can squeeze but nothing more is going to come out. And then what do you do then? So it's time for this president to get real about the reform agenda, to stop dilly-dallying and shilly-shallying around his factions in his party, to get the reform agenda through his government so that we can start to have an efficient, effective state where less money is spent on politicians and government and more money is spent on people and services. Thank you.
Kevin, let's hold on. Kevin, just before you come up, I am doing last rounds now. You've got, if you can just please answer the question around also the funding gap there. But I just want to add one more that has come through from OFM News, from Paul from OFM News. And it reads, what would monitoring implications be of no more fuel levy? In other words, where is money being channeled to? And can they go without the funds? So if the RAF is discontinued, seeing as they essentially broke, what would be the realistic replacement be? And how could they settle the outstanding claims and payouts? Why is regulation necessary? And what are the possible negatives if not regulated anymore? So I thought perhaps as a way of concluding, Kevin, you can answer all the questions.
Thank you, Siviwe. So I just want to go back to the question from Jeffreys Bay about why aren't ministers and members of parliament feeling this fuel price pinch? And I want to stress that we absolutely, as members of parliament, ordinary members of parliament, do feel the fuel price pinch. We do feel your pain. I can tell you that filling up my car hurts my wallet every single time I go to the petrol station. But the ministers don't. The ministers are shuttled around on your dime. And that's exactly what John was talking about. Our bloated cabinet with these big SUVs and their VIP protection are paid for by you, the consumer, you, the citizen. And part of that pay comes out of the general fuel levy that we're talking about. So the question from OFM about the road accident fund and how they would settle the outstanding accounts and the like, I think it's very unfair to place the burden on the vast majority of South Africans who are law-abiding citizens, drivers, and road users. It's unfair to place the burden on them for the few who do cause road accidents or who are involved in road accidents. And that's what the RAF levy does. What we are proposing is that a third-party insurance, where you take out third-party insurance and you can prove to SARS that you have paid your third-party insurance on your tax return, you will be able to claim your fuel purchases, the RAF levy, back on your tax return as a tax rebate. So while that doesn't address the problems at the RAF, it addresses the problem that every single road user, every single person who goes and buys petrol is paying for the dysfunctionality of the RAF. It's addressing the problem by making you as the citizen, you as the individual, you as the driver responsible for your own insurance if you're involved in an accident. I hope that helps, sir.
Thank you very much, John and Kevin. And please, ladies and gentlemen, do feel free to contact our team for any further questions. And so now this brings our media briefing on the fuel levy issue to a close. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody.